I think maybe the biggest news for the market certainly this week were the CPI numbers that really disappointed to the upside here, particularly on the core. What did you make of those numbers?
Look, for me, they were unwelcome, but not wholly unexpected. I think the right reading of the data all along has been that headline inflation fluctuates substantially, but we've got a significant underlying inflation problem. And that's what that core inflation rate, where the month was faster than the quarter was faster than the half year was faster than the year, and the year was faster than last year. That's what it showed. And the month was at a close to 7% core rate. We've got a substantial underlying inflation problem. Another way to see that was that median inflation is higher than it's been any time since we started collecting the data. Another way to see that is that we're seeing substantial inflation in the housing components of the index, which we know have very substantial persistence. Yet another way to see that is in the data from the Atlanta Fed, which I think is probably the best wage indicator on those who are switching jobs, which show where the market really is, unlike those who are staying on jobs, which was running at 8% or more. So we've got a substantial underlying inflation problem that doesn't come out without very substantial monetary policy adjustment, and the market is waking up to that fact and is now building in substantially more monetary policy adjustment than it was, with the terminal Fed funds rate up now at 4.5. If you think back, David, it's been an extraordinary journey. It was only 15 months ago that the Fed was saying that the rate was going to be zero in mid-2023, and now it's saying that that rate is going to approach 4.5. And so the idea that that would change financial conditions can hardly be a very surprising one.
So Larry, let's pick up on exactly that point. As far as you see it right now, what would you project the so-called terminal rate to be? We've got the head of economics at Bloomberg saying 5%. Deutsche Bank says 5%. Where do you think we end up?
That wouldn't surprise me. Certainly at 450, there's more realism in market pricing than there was several months ago. I think we're more likely to end up above 4.5 than we are to end up below 4.5. And it certainly wouldn't surprise me if that rate has to get above 5 if we are really going to, in a determined way, contain and control inflation. Whether the Fed is going to stay the course and do what's necessary to contain inflation, we're going to have to see how that plays down the road. Rick Mishkin, a former Fed governor, had a very strong op-ed this week, making a point that I've made a number of times, that even Paul Volcker had a kind of false start on inflation containment, where he brought down rates in response to bad economic statistics in the spring of 1980, which then had to be reversed and forced us to have even higher rates than we otherwise would have had to have in the early 1980s. So I think it's not going to be easy to do what's necessary. History records many, many instances when policy adjustments to inflation were excessively delayed, and there were very substantial costs to that, again and again, through the 1960s and 70s, for example. I am aware of no major example in which the central bank reacted with excessive speed to inflation and a large cost was paid. And so I think that lesson, that in terms of minimizing the risk of a stagflationary catastrophe, the Fed has to be prepared to stay the course, is the important one to internalize.
Larry, as you know so well and have said repeatedly on this program, one of the major components of inflation are wages. We walked right up to the brink of a national rail strike this week in the United States. We've avoided, at least tentatively, with a tentative agreement. Obviously, that would not have been good for the economy if there had been a strike. At the same time, what does it say about the hydraulic pressure from organized labor and otherwise on wages?
David, I think we have failed on labor rights in this country over the last generation. It has been far too easy to fire union organizers. We have not done enough labor law reform to support the right to organize, which I think is something fundamental to having an effectively functioning labor market, and something that is essential to having a fair and just society. But I do think at a moment like this, when inflation is a crucial issue, the federal government needs to be very careful to keep a focus on all that it buys and all that it sets a pattern for, to pay attention to holding costs down rather than rewarding workers. And I think there are a variety of provisions that try to maximize the wages of those who are involved in activity the government is supporting. And so I worry about provisions that seek to enshrine high wages, for example, in those who are producing goods related to the environment. And I think the federal government has to walk a very careful balance here between restoring appropriate labor rights, which has been a real flaw and huge problem for the last 30 years, and doing things that will entrench inflation through wage pressure to the detriment of the overall economy, including the economy of workers who work with their hands.
And finally, Larry, let's turn to geopolitics for a minute. Obviously, Ukraine had a rather good week, I'd say, with the advances it made in the Northeast, with Russian troops retreating, or even an absolute rout. On the other hand, President Putin had sort of a rough week as he met with President Xi, and President Xi has some concerns about that war. What do you make of what's going on there?
I was heartened by the Ukrainian success. But I think that from an economic point of view, we're going to have to be very thoughtful about how we support Ukraine as hyperinflation becomes a greater risk in Ukraine. And I think more broadly, there's enormous uncertainty in markets for natural gas, in oil markets, through those markets, in markets for diesel fuel, and for fertilizer. And a great deal, we don't always say this, but a great deal in the U.S. inflation process is going to hinge on whether, as markets tend to be pricing, oil prices stay moderate or even come down, or whether, as geopolitical experts warn, we hit adverse developments and those prices spike up again. I don't have the wisdom to know which will happen, but I do think it's going to be an enormous factor for the inflation process in the months ahead.
Okay, Larry, thank you.